The autumn of 1876 painted the Dakota Territory in shades of copper and gold. But beneath the beauty lay a landscape scarred by broken treaties and spilled blood. In a remote valley where the Cheyenne River carved its ancient path through limestone bluffs, a young woman named Catherine Wells would make a choice that would ignite a chain of events. Neither she nor the most powerful war chief of the Lakota Sioux could have foreseen. What began as a simple act of mercy would challenge everything both cultures believed about enemies and allies, about healing and warfare, about the courage it takes to see humanity in those we've been taught to fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Catherine Wells discovered the burnt remains of the Henderson homestead. The first snow of winter was already dusting the ridgelines of the Black Hills. She sat astride her bay mare, Molly, staring at the blackened timbers and scattered belongings that had once been her nearest neighbor's home. The acrid smell of charred wood still hung in the crystalline air, mixing with the metallic scent of coming snow to create an atmosphere of desolation that seemed to seep into her very bones. 20-3 years old and unmarried, Catherine had been living alone on her deceased father's homestead for 8 months now, ever since consumption had claimed Dr. Marcus Wells in the bitter cold of the previous February. The isolation hadn't bothered her initially. In fact, after years of serving as her father's assistant, mixing tonics and setting bones for every soul within a 50-mile radius of their remote cabin, the solitude had felt like a kind of freedom. She could tend her garden, read her father's medical journals by lamplight, and practice the healing arts he had taught her without the constant stream of injured farmers, pregnant wives, and fevered children that had filled their home during his lifetime. But now, staring at the destruction before her, Catherine felt the weight of her isolation pressing down like a physical thing. The Henderson family, Jacob, his wife Mary, and their 3 young children, had been her lifeline to the outside world. Jacob would ride over every few weeks with news from Deadwood, supplies from the general store, and Mary's warm sourdough bread that reminded Catherine of her own mother's baking before the fever had taken her when Catherine was 12. Now they were gone, not dead, thank God. The absence of graves told her that much. But fled, like so many others, as tensions between the expanding settlements and the Sioux tribes reached a boiling point following Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn. Just 4 months earlier, the Army's subsequent campaigns had driven many tribal bands further west, but scattered war parties still moved through the territory, and the mere rumor of their presence was enough to send settler families packing for the relative safety of the larger towns. Catherine dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the cold ride. The devastation was methodical rather than chaotic. The house had been burned, but the barn remained standing. The livestock were gone, but not slaughtered, driven off most likely. Personal belongings lay scattered, but she could see the clear signs of hasty packing rather than violent looting. This wasn't the work of a war party. This was the work of a family terrified into abandoning everything they couldn't carry. She walked through the debris, her boot crunching on fragments of Mary's blue china teacups, the ones she'd brought all the way from Ohio and had been so proud of. A child's wooden toy horse lay half buried under a collapsed beam, one wheel missing. Catherine picked it up, remembering how young Tommy Henderson had played with it on the porch during her last visit, just 3 weeks ago, making galloping sounds as he raced it along the wooden planks while his mother and Catherine shared coffee and worried conversation about the increasing reports of Indian raids, the conversations that autumn had grown darker with each visit. Jacob would arrive with newspapers from Deadwood, filled with accounts of skirmishes, missing travelers, and burned-out claims. The Army was stretched thin, trying to patrol an impossibly vast territory with insufficient men and supplies. Settlers were abandoning their claims in growing numbers, heading back east or clustering together in fortified towns. The dream of carving civilization out of the wilderness was colliding with the harsh reality that this land already belonged to people who had no intention of surrendering it without a fight. Catherine had listened to these reports with growing unease, but she had refused Jacob's increasingly urgent suggestions that she abandon her homestead and move to Deadwood. Where would she go? What would she do? Her father had sunk every penny he had into the 160 acres they'd claimed under the Homestead Act. The cabin, small though it was, represented 5 years of backbreaking labor, clearing fields, building corrals, establishing the medicinal garden. That provided many of the herbs Catherine still used in her healing practice. More than that, it was the last tangible connection she had to her father's memory, to the life they had built together in this wild country. But standing now in the ruins of the Henderson place, Catherine felt the full weight of her vulnerability crashing down upon her. She was utterly alone in a territory where being alone meant being defenseless. The nearest remaining neighbor was old Pete Morrison, and his cabin was a hard day's ride to the south. The closest thing resembling law enforcement was the undermanned Army garrison at Fort Robinson, more than 2 days away, even in good weather. And winter was coming, bringing with it the long months of isolation when travel became nearly impossible and help, if needed, would be impossible to summon. She climbed back onto Molly and turned toward home, but the mare seemed to sense her rider's distress and moved at a reluctant pace, as if unwilling to return to the lonely cabin that awaited them. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the snow-dusted landscape in shades of pink and orange that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now the approaching darkness felt ominous, a reminder of how quickly safety could vanish in this unforgiving land. The ride back to her homestead took her through a narrow valley carved by Willow Creek, where cottonwoods lined the water's edge and provided some shelter from the constant wind. Catherine had always loved this part of the journey home, the way the creek's gentle murmur and the rustling of leaves created a pocket of peace in the vast emptiness. Today, however, every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound made her turn in the saddle to scan the ridgelines for movement. Her father had been a man of science, trained at Harvard Medical College before the wanderlust and promise of frontier opportunity had drawn him west. He had taught Catherine to rely on observation, logic, and empirical evidence rather than superstition or unfounded fear. But he had also been practical enough to teach her to shoot, to read weather signs, and to trust her instincts when something felt wrong. And today, everything felt wrong. The cabin came into view as she crested the final hill, its small windows glowing yellow with the lamplight she had left burning that morning. The sight should have been comforting, but instead it only emphasized how visible and vulnerable her home was to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. The neat vegetable garden, the small corral where her 2 remaining horses waited, the woodshed stocked for winter, all of it suddenly seemed like a target rather than a refuge. Inside, Catherine went through the motions of her evening routine, but her movements were mechanical, distracted. She fed the horses, checked the chickens, brought in firewood for the night, but her mind kept returning to the scene at the Henderson place, to the implications of their departure. If Jacob Henderson, a man who had fought in the war between the states and was as tough and practical as they came, had decided the risk was too great to stay, what did that say about her own situation? She prepared a simple dinner of cornbread and beans, but found she had little appetite. The silence of the cabin, which had been a comfort for so many months, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the settling logs, every whisper of wind around the eaves, every distant call of a coyote seemed amplified in the stillness. She found herself starting at shadows, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle that hung above the mantel. Catherine tried to lose herself in one of her father's medical journals, but the words swam before her eyes, her concentration shattered by the weight of her predicament. She was trapped between impossible choices, each leading down a path she was reluctant to take. She could abandon the homestead, as the Hendersons had done, but where would she go? She had no family left, no connections in the eastern cities that might offer her shelter. Her skills as a healer might find welcome at a place like Deadwood, but the gold rush town was rough and dangerous in its own way, full of miners, gamblers, and desperate men who saw a woman alone as easy prey. Alternatively, she could stay and hope that the troubles would pass, that the army would establish enough control to make the territory safe again. But how long could she survive in isolation? Winter was approaching, and if something happened to her, injury, illness, accident, there would be no one to help, no one to even know she was in trouble until spring came, and someone finally thought to check on the remote cabin. As night deepened around her small home, Catherine found herself thinking about her father's stories of his early days as a frontier doctor. He had spoken often of the delicate balance required to practice medicine in a land where civilized conveniences were scarce and danger was never far away. Healing, he had told her more than once, requires not just knowledge but courage. The courage to act when action might be dangerous. The courage to help those who might not be able to help you in return. The courage to see past superficial differences to the common humanity beneath. At the time, she had thought he was speaking primarily about the challenges of treating rough miners and cowboys, men who might be suspicious of book learning or reluctant to follow medical advice. She had never imagined that his words might apply to something far more complex and dangerous than dealing with difficult patients. But now, alone in her cabin with the weight of an impossible decision pressing down upon her, Catherine began to understand that her father had been preparing her for choices that would test not just her medical skills, but her fundamental beliefs about what it meant to be human in an inhumane world. The question was not simply whether she would stay or go, but what kind of person she would choose to be in the face of fear and uncertainty. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and causing the flames in the fireplace to dance and flicker. Catherine added another log to the fire and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt seemed to come from deeper than the weather, from the growing realization that her comfortable, isolated life was about to change. Whether she wanted it to or not, she thought about the medical supplies she still had stored in her father's old black bag and in the cabinet he had built specially for herbs and instruments. Laudanum for pain, quinine for fever, various tonics and poultices for treating wounds and infections. Tools and knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone who needed them. Her father had never turned away a patient, based on their ability to pay, their social standing, or even their reputation. Sickness and injury, he had often said, are universal languages. They speak to our shared vulnerability, our common need for compassion. But what if that patient was someone her own people considered an enemy? What if helping them put her own life in danger? What if the very act of healing became a bridge across a divide that others insisted must remain unbridgeable? These were questions Catherine had never expected to face, questions that seemed to have no clear answers. As she sat by her fire, listening to the wind howl around her cabin and feeling the weight of her isolation like a physical presence, she could not have known that within days, those theoretical questions would become a desperate reality, and her choice would set in motion events that would test every principle her father had taught her about the practice of healing and the courage required to remain human in an inhuman world. The snow that had been threatening all day finally began to fall in earnest as midnight approached, large flakes drifting past her windows like ghostly messengers. Catherine banked the fire and prepared for bed, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay listening to the storm building outside, to the increasing intensity of the wind, and to the profound silence that stretched between her cabin and the rest of the world. Her father's medical bag sat in the corner where she had left it after her last patient, a trapper named William Foster who had suffered a broken wrist in a fall from his horse 2 weeks earlier. The bag had belonged to her grandfather, then her father, and now her. 3 generations of healers, each facing their own challenges in bringing medical knowledge to places where such knowledge was desperately needed, but often undervalued. Her father had told her stories of her grandfather treating wounded soldiers during the Mexican War, of the difficult choices he had faced when Confederate and Union wounded lay side by side in makeshift field hospitals. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Medicine knows no politics, Catherine. Her father had often reminded her when sharing these family stories. Pain is pain, regardless of the uniform worn by the one who suffers it. A healer's oath transcends the divisions that men create to justify their hatred of one another. Now those words echoed in her mind as she considered her precarious situation. Her father had been speaking of war between Americans, between men who shared a common language and culture even when they fought on opposite sides. But what of wars between peoples who seemed to share nothing at all? What of the conflict raging across the Dakota Territory, where every encounter between white and Indian seemed to end in bloodshed, where trust had been so thoroughly destroyed by broken treaties and mutual atrocities that the very concept of coexistence seemed impossible? Catherine rose from her bed and walked to the window, pulling back the simple cotton curtain to peer out into the swirling snow. The storm was intensifying, the kind of early winter blizzard that could trap travelers for days and claim lives with its sudden ferocity. Anyone caught out in this weather would be in mortal danger, regardless of their skill or preparation. The thought made her grateful for her sturdy cabin and well-stocked larder, but it also filled her with anxiety for any soul unfortunate enough to be exposed to the elements. She returned to her father's chair by the fireplace, unable to settle, her racing mind enough for sleep. The leather volume of Gray's Anatomy lay open on the small table beside the chair, its pages filled with her father's careful annotations in the margins. He had been a methodical man, constantly updating his knowledge as new medical discoveries reached the frontier. Even in his final illness, he had continued to study, to learn, to prepare for cases he would never live to treat. Catherine found herself thinking about the last serious case she had handled alone, a difficult childbirth for the wife of a homesteader named Samuel Fletcher. The woman had been in labor for nearly 2 days when Fletcher had ridden through a thunderstorm to fetch Catherine, his face wild with desperation and fear. The situation had been complicated by the baby's breech presentation, a condition that often proved fatal for both mother and child when skilled medical help was not available. Drawing on everything her father had taught her, Catherine had managed to safely deliver a healthy daughter and save the mother's life. The gratitude in Samuel Fletcher's eyes, the overwhelming relief of his wife, the tiny cry of new life in a harsh world, these were the moments that reminded Catherine why she had chosen to continue her father's work despite the loneliness and danger of frontier life. But that case had also highlighted her limitations. She was skilled for someone of her age and circumstances, but she was not a formally trained physician. Her education had come from her father's teaching, from careful study of his medical books, and from hands-on experience gained by assisting him for years. She could set bones, treat infections, deliver babies, and handle many of the medical emergencies that arose in frontier life. But there were limits to her knowledge, situations where a more experienced doctor might succeed where she would fail. The thought of her limitations led her mind down a darker path. What if she encountered a medical emergency she could not handle? What if someone died because she lacked the knowledge or skill to save them? Her father had prepared her as well as he could, but he had also been honest about the weight of responsibility that came with being the only source of medical care for miles around. Every healer faces cases they cannot win, he had told her during one of their long conversations about the practice of medicine. The key is to try everything within your power and knowledge, and then to accept that sometimes death comes despite our best efforts. But never let the fear of failure prevent you from trying. The attempt to heal is itself a sacred act, regardless of the outcome. Catherine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and added another log to the fire. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind was growing stronger, driving the snow almost horizontally past her windows. She found herself wondering about the other scattered homesteaders and trappers who called this vast territory home. Were they all safely sheltered? Or was someone out there struggling against the elements, fighting for survival in the face of nature's indifferent fury? The isolation that had seemed like freedom just months ago now felt like a burden almost too heavy to bear. Catherine realized that she had been living in a kind of denial, pretending that her father's death had not fundamentally changed her. Circumstances. While he lived, she had been part of a team, an assistant to an experienced physician who bore the ultimate responsibility for their patients' welfare. Now she was the physician, the one to whom desperate people would turn when death threatened those they loved. She thought about the medical supplies stored in her cabin, the laudanum and quinine, the surgical instruments her father had brought from the East, the carefully preserved herbs and tinctures that could mean the difference between life and death for someone in need. These supplies represented more than just material resources. They were tools of healing that carried with them the obligation to use them wisely and compassionately. But what happened when using those tools meant risking her own life? What happened when the oath to heal conflicted with the instinct to survive? These were questions her father had never fully prepared her to answer, perhaps because he had never imagined she would face them alone. The wind rattled the cabin's windows with renewed force, and Catherine found herself thinking about the stories that had reached her from other parts of the territory. Tales of settlers who had tried to help wounded Indians only to find themselves accused of collaboration by their own people. Stories of Indians who had been betrayed after accepting help from whites, leading to a deep distrust that made future assistance nearly impossible. The lines drawn by fear and hatred seemed to make any act of compassion a dangerous gamble. Yet Catherine also remembered other stories her father had shared. Accounts of frontier doctors who had treated anyone who needed help, regardless of race or allegiance. These men had often faced criticism and even threats from their own communities, but they had persisted in their belief that healing transcended political divisions. Some had died for their principles, but others had lived to see their example inspire a new generation of healers who understood that medicine was fundamentally about preserving life, not taking it. As the night wore on, Catherine found herself caught between these competing examples, between the voice of caution that urged her to think of her own safety first, and the voice of conscience that reminded her of the oath every healer took to do no harm and to help whenever possible. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil in her heart, both forces of nature unleashing their power without regard for the fragile human lives caught in their path. She did not know that barely 15 miles away, a young Lakota warrior named Joseph Crow Feather was lying unconscious in a hidden ravine, burning with fever from an infected arrow wound, while his desperate companions debated whether it was safe to seek help from the white settlement they knew lay somewhere in the valley below. She did not know that his father, Chief Running Bear, was one of the most feared war leaders in the entire Sioux Confederation, or that the young man's life or death might tip the balance between continued warfare and a chance for peace. She did not know that by dawn, 3 exhausted Lakota warriors would be watching her cabin from the cover of the pine trees that bordered her property, trying to summon the courage to approach the home of a white woman who represented everything their people had been taught to distrust, but who might be the only hope for saving the life of their chief's beloved son. All Catherine knew, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, was that her world had irrevocably changed, and that the morning would bring choices she was not yet prepared to make. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil in her heart, and both would rage through the long hours of darkness before dawn brought with it the first test of everything she believed about healing, humanity, and the courage required to bridge seemingly Impossible divides dot in her dreams. Catherine found herself standing in a vast snow-covered plain, holding her father's medical bag while shadowy figures approached from all directions. Some came seeking help, others came with weapons drawn, and she could not tell which was which until they were close enough to strike. She woke several times during the night, her heart pounding, only to find that the storm continued to rage outside her windows, as relentless and unforgiving as the conflicts that divided the people of the Dakota Territory. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Dakota Territory, the storm having spent its fury sometime during the pre-dawn hours. Catherine woke to an eerie silence, the kind that follows a heavy snowfall when the world seems muffled and transformed. She rose stiffly from her father's chair where she had dozed fitfully, her neck aching from the awkward position. Through frost-covered windows, she could see that nearly 2 feet of snow had fallen during the night, covering her familiar landscape in pristine white that made everything look foreign and new. The fire had burned low, and she quickly added kindling to coax it back to life before checking her supplies. The storm had been worse than she'd anticipated, and she realized with growing concern that she might be truly snowed in for several days. Her woodpile was adequate but not abundant, and while she had enough food to last, the isolation would be complete until the snow began to melt or someone with a strong horse and determination decided to check on her welfare. Catherine dressed quickly in her warmest clothing, wool stockings, a heavy brown skirt, and the thick sweater her father had brought her from a trading post in Deadwood the previous winter. Over this she pulled on the fur-lined coat that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she had managed to bring west when the family had made their fateful decision to seek their fortune on the frontier. The morning chores took longer than usual in the deep snow. Breaking ice on the water trough for her horses required considerable effort, and reaching the chicken coop meant wading through drifts that came nearly to her knees. The chickens huddled together for warmth, clearly displeased with the weather, but otherwise unharmed. As she scattered grain for them, Catherine found herself grateful for these simple tasks that gave structure to her day and distracted her mind from the larger uncertainties that plagued her thoughts. It was while she was returning from the barn, her arms full of additional firewood, that she first noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked like deer prints crossing her property from the tree line toward the creek. But as she looked more carefully, something about the pattern seemed wrong. The prints were too deep for deer, too purposeful in their direction. And there, barely visible in the snow near the edge of her garden, she spotted what looked unmistakably like the print of a moccasin. Catherine set down her armload of wood and moved closer to examine the tracks, her heart beginning to race. The prints were definitely human, and recent enough that the falling snow hadn't had time to completely obscure them. 3 sets of tracks, moving from the forest toward her property and then apparently circling back toward the creek. Someone had been watching her cabin during the night. Her father's warnings about frontier safety echoed in her mind as she quickly gathered the firewood and hurried back inside, barring the door behind her. She retrieved her father's rifle from above the mantel and checked that it was loaded, her hands trembling slightly as she handled the familiar weapon. Dr. Wells had insisted that his daughter learn to shoot, not just for protection against wild animals but for the more serious threats that could arise in lawless territory, where the nearest help might be days away. From her window, Catherine scanned the tree line for any sign of movement, but the snow-laden pines revealed nothing. Whoever had been watching seemed to have withdrawn, at least for now. But the knowledge that strangers had been observing her home filled her with a dread that made her earlier worries about isolation seem trivial by comparison. In her current situation, cut off by snow and completely alone, she was utterly vulnerable to anyone who might wish her harm. The morning passed slowly, with Catherine alternating between routine tasks and nervous surveillance of her surroundings. She prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge and coffee, but found she had little appetite. Every sound seemed amplified: the settling of the cabin timbers, the occasional thump of snow sliding off the roof, the distant call of a crow. She found herself starting at shadows and checking the rifle's position obsessively. It was just past noon when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. The low, mournful howl of a wolf coming from the direction of the creek. But as she listened more carefully, Catherine realized the sound was wrong somehow. The pitch and rhythm didn't match any wolf call she had ever heard. After a moment, she understood with a chill of recognition that the sound was human, a signal being passed between unseen watchers. Moving carefully to avoid showing herself at the windows, Catherine positioned herself where she could observe the approach to her cabin while remaining hidden. The rifle lay ready across her lap, and she had placed additional ammunition within easy reach. Her father had taught her to shoot accurately, but she had never fired at another human being, and she prayed she would not have to start now. The wait stretched endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. Then, just as Catherine was beginning to wonder if she had imagined the signals, 3 figures emerged from the tree line. Even at a distance, their appearance left no doubt about their identity. They moved in single file through the deep snow, their dark hair and clothing marking them unmistakably as Indians. 2 of them carried what appeared to be rifles, while the third bore a heavy burden on his back that she couldn't identify from her vantage point. Catherine's grip tightened on her rifle as the figures approached, but she noticed something that gave her pause. Their movement was cautious but not stealthy, and they made no attempt to spread out or surround her cabin, as she might have expected from a war party. Instead, they advanced directly toward her front door, stopping about 20 yards away where they could easily be seen and heard. The leader of the group, a tall man with graying hair and deeply weathered features, raised his empty hands above his head in what was clearly intended as a peaceful gesture. When he spoke, his words were in heavily accented English but clear enough to understand. "White medicine woman," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We come in peace. We need help." Catherine remained hidden, her mind racing. The request for help was the last thing she had expected, and it created a dilemma she was completely unprepared to face. Every instinct screamed at her to remain hidden, to wait until they left, or to fire warning shots to drive them away. The stories of Indian raids and settler deaths were too numerous and too recent to ignore. Yet something in the man's tone, the way he held his hands in supplication rather than threat, gave her pause. "My son dies," the man continued when she didn't respond. "Arrow wound, much fever. We know you heal white people. Will you heal the Indian?" The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. A medical emergency, the one situation her father had taught her never to ignore regardless of circumstances. She found herself thinking of the oath that guided her practice, the fundamental principle that healing should be offered to anyone who needed it. But she also thought of her own safety, of the very real possibility that this was some kind of trap. From her hidden position, Catherine studied the 3 men more carefully. The leader appeared to be middle-aged, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but clearly desperate. The second man was younger, perhaps in his 30s, and carried himself like a warrior despite his current peaceful posture. But it was the third figure that captured her attention and ultimately decided her course of action. The man carrying the burden was struggling with its weight, and as Catherine watched, she realized he was carrying another person, a young man who appeared to be unconscious. Even from a distance, she could see that the burden-bearer was exhausted, swaying slightly as he stood. And now she could see what looked like blood staining the snow where they stood. The sight of genuine medical need overrode Catherine's caution. She had seen too many people die from treatable conditions, had witnessed too much preventable suffering, to turn away from someone who might be saved with proper care. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her mind, "Pain is pain, regardless of the uniform worn by the one who suffers it." Moving to the window where she could be seen, Catherine called out, "How do I know you won't harm me if I help?" The older man's relief at receiving a response was visible even at a distance. "I give you my word," he replied solemnly. "I am Black Eagle of the Minneconjou Lakota. My word is known among all tribes. No harm will come to you if you try to save my son." Catherine knew enough about Indian culture to understand that such a public declaration of protection was not given lightly. Still, she hesitated. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to refuse, to send them away and hope they found help elsewhere. But as she watched the man holding the unconscious figure struggle to remain upright, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she turned away from someone who might die without her intervention. "Put down your weapons," she called out. "All of them. And step back from the cabin." The three men complied immediately, placing their rifles in the snow and backing away several paces. The gesture of trust was not lost on Catherine. They were making themselves vulnerable to demonstrate their peaceful intentions. Taking a deep breath that felt like it might be her last, Catherine unbarred her door and stepped outside, rifle still in hand but pointed at the ground. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Quickly before we all freeze." The relief on Black Eagle's face was unmistakable as he gestured to his companions. The man carrying the unconscious figure moved toward the cabin with renewed energy, while the older man gathered up their weapons to bring them inside as well, a gesture that spoke to his trust in Catherine's promise of help. As they approached, Catherine got her first clear look at the patient. He was young, probably not much older than herself, with the lean build of a warrior but skin that was pale and clammy with fever. Blood had soaked through makeshift bandaging around his left shoulder, and she could see the telltale flush of infection spreading down his arm. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and when she touched his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin told her everything she needed to know about the severity of his condition. "How long has he been like this?" she asked as they carried him inside and laid him on her father's examining table. "3 days," Black Eagle replied, hovering anxiously nearby. "Arrow wound from fight with Crow warriors. We tried to treat, but the fever grows worse." Catherine began cutting away the blood-soaked bandages, revealing a wound that made her catch her breath. The arrow had penetrated deeply into the shoulder, and while it had been removed, the extraction had been done crudely, leaving fragments of arrowhead and clothing in the wound. The infection was well established, with angry red streaks radiating outward from the entry point. "What is his name?" she asked as she began assembling the supplies she would need. "Joseph Crow Feather," Black Eagle answered. "He is my youngest son." Catherine nodded, focusing on the medical challenge before her rather than the political implications of treating the son of what was clearly an important Lakota leader. She had work to do, and the patient's identity was irrelevant to the immediate task of saving his life. The next several hours tested every skill her father had taught her. The wound needed to be thoroughly cleaned and debrided, a painful process that required removing all infected tissue and foreign material. She administered laudanum for pain. Though she was careful to use it sparingly, her supplies were limited, and she had no way of knowing when she might be able to replenish them. Working by lamplight in her small cabin, with 3 armed Lakota warriors watching her every move, Catherine found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of medical practice. The external circumstances faded into the background as she focused on the immediate needs of her patient. This was what her father had trained her for, what all those hours of study and practice had prepared her to do. That Joseph Crow Feather regained consciousness briefly during the cleaning process, his eyes opening to focus on Catherine's face with a mixture of confusion and pain. She spoke to him gently, explaining what she was doing even though she wasn't sure he understood English. But her tone seemed to calm him, and he submitted to her ministrations without struggle. "He knows you try to help," Black Eagle observed, watching his son's reaction to Catherine's care. He has heard stories of white medicine, some good, some bad. As Catherine worked, she learned more about her unexpected patients. Black Eagle was indeed a prominent leader among the Minneconne Sioux, one of the bands that had been involved in the fighting at Little Bighorn. His son Joseph was considered one of the most promising young warriors of his generation, skilled in both warfare and diplomacy. The wound had been received during a skirmish with Crow Scouts who had been trailing their hunting party. "We did not want to come here," admitted the younger warrior, who had introduced himself as Standing Wolf. "Too dangerous for all, but Joseph grows worse each day. We hear of white medicine woman who lives alone, who helped trapper with broken bones. We hope maybe she help Indian too." The reference to William Foster, the trapper she had treated weeks earlier, surprised Catherine. She hadn't realized that news of her medical practice had spread among the Indian communities, or that they had been observing the settlements closely enough to know about her work. It was both unsettling and oddly reassuring to know that her reputation as a healer had preceded her. By late afternoon, Catherine had done everything she could for the immediate crisis. The wound was clean, properly dressed with her best medicinal herbs, and she had administered what antibiotics she could brew from her father's stores. But Joseph's fever remained dangerously high, and she knew the next 24 hours would be critical. "He needs rest and careful monitoring," she explained to Black Eagle. "The fever may get worse before it gets better. Someone should stay with him through the night." "We all stay," Black Eagle replied without hesitation. "We cannot move him now, and we will not leave him." Catherine realized she was committed now to hosting 3 Lakota warriors overnight in her small cabin. The situation was unprecedented and potentially explosive, but she found herself oddly calm about it. These men had shown her nothing but respect and gratitude for her efforts to save Joseph's life. Whatever their reputation as warriors, in her cabin they were simply family members worried about a loved one. As evening approached, the small cabin took on an atmosphere unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. The 3 Lakota men settled themselves around the room with the patient, taking turns to monitor Joseph's condition and speaking in low voices in their own language. Despite the language barrier, Catherine found herself included in their vigil, with Black Eagle occasionally translating their discussions or asking her questions about his son's condition. The cultural divide that had seemed so vast and threatening just hours earlier began to feel more manageable as the evening progressed. These were not the savage raiders of frontier nightmares, but men who loved their families and feared for their children just as any parents would. Their concern for Joseph, their gratitude for Catherine's help, their careful respect for her home and belongings, all of it spoke to a shared humanity that transcended the political conflicts raging across the territory. As night fell and the temperature dropped, Catherine prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans, uncertain whether her guests would accept food from a white woman. But Black Eagle accepted the offered meal with grave politeness, and she watched as he tasted it first before allowing the others to eat, a precaution that spoke to the very real dangers they all faced in this unprecedented situation. "You take great risk helping us," Black Eagle said as they shared the simple meal. "Your people will not understand." Catherine looked at Joseph, still unconscious but breathing more easily than when they had first brought him in. "My father taught me that healing is not about politics," she replied. "It's about preserving life wherever we find it." Black Eagle nodded slowly. "Wise man, your father. In our way, we say medicine is a gift from the Great Spirit, not to be withheld from any who suffer." As the night deepened around them, Catherine realized that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of the world. The clear divisions between us and them that had seemed so obvious that morning had blurred into something more complex and humane. She was still afraid. The situation remained dangerous for all of them, but her fear was tempered now by respect for these men who had risked everything to seek help for one of their own. The real test would come with morning, when Joseph's fever would either break or worsen, when the consequences of her choice to help would become clear. But for now, in the lamplight of her small cabin, surrounded by the quiet conversation of worried family members, Catherine felt she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, further isolating them from the outside world and its conflicts, creating a temporary sanctuary where healing could take precedence over hatred, where the ancient bonds of compassion could bridge even the deepest divides. The first sign of trouble came with the dawn of the third day. Catherine had spent the previous 48 hours in an exhausting cycle of monitoring Joseph's fever, changing his bandages and brewing medicinal teas from her dwindling supply of herbs. The young warrior's condition had stabilized somewhat. His fever had broken briefly during the second night, allowing him periods of lucid consciousness, but he remained weak and vulnerable to relapse. She was mixing a fresh poultice when the sound reached her ears, the distant but unmistakable thunder of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Multiple horses, moving with the purposeful urgency that suggested official business rather than casual travel. Catherine's blood chilled as she realized what this likely meant. Someone had discovered the tracks around her cabin, or perhaps seen the smoke from her consistently burning fire and had come to investigate. Black Eagle heard it too, his weathered face immediately shifting from the gentle concern he had shown while watching over his son to the alert wariness of a war leader who had survived countless dangerous encounters. He moved to the window with fluid grace, peering carefully through the gap in the curtains without exposing himself to view from outside. "Soldiers," he said quietly, his English becoming more clipped under stress. "Many, coming fast." Catherine felt her heart sink as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. For 3 days she had existed in a strange bubble of shared purpose with these Lakota men, focused entirely on saving Joseph's life and finding unexpected common ground across cultural divides. But the outside world had not ceased to exist during their makeshift truce, and now it was arriving with all its prejudices and conflicts intact. Standing Wolf and the third warrior, a quiet man named Gray Hawk, who had barely spoken since their arrival, immediately began moving with practiced efficiency. Without needing to discuss it, they began gathering their weapons and preparing for what could quickly become a siege situation. The transformation from worried family members to combat-ready warriors happened so quickly that Catherine was reminded of just how dangerous her guests could be if circumstances forced them to fight. "How many?" she asked, moving to join Black Eagle at the window. 12, maybe 15, he replied grimly. "Too many to fight in open ground. We are trapped." Catherine could see them now, a column of blue-uniformed cavalry riding hard through the snow. At their head rode a figure she recognized with growing dread, Captain Marcus Sullivan, the commanding officer from Fort Robinson. Sullivan was known throughout the territory as a hard man, uncompromising in his hatred of Indians, and firmly convinced that the only solution to the Indian problem was complete military subjugation. If he had come here looking for trouble, he would not be easily deterred from finding it. "There's a root cellar," Catherine said quickly, her mind racing through possibilities. "Behind the cabin. You could hide there until they leave." Black Eagle shook his head. "If they search, they will find tracks, and my son cannot be moved." He looked at Joseph, who was awake but still pale and weak from his ordeal. "We stay. We face what comes." The sound of horses drew closer, and Catherine realized she had perhaps minutes to decide how to handle the approaching confrontation. Her choices were limited, and all of them dangerous. She could try to hide the presence of her guests, but as Black Eagle had noted, the evidence of their stay would be impossible to conceal completely. She could claim they were her prisoners, but that lie would be exposed the moment anyone looked closely at the situation. Or she could tell the truth and hope that Captain Sullivan would respect her role as a healer and the temporary sanctuary her cabin had become. None of these options seemed likely to end well for anyone involved. The horses came to a halt outside her cabin with a jingle of bridles and creak of leather. Captain Sullivan's voice rang out, harsh and demanding. "Miss Wells, open this door immediately. We have reports of Indian activity in this area." Catherine took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and moved toward the door. Behind her, she could sense the Lakota warriors preparing for whatever might come next. Joseph struggled to sit up on the examining table, his fever-bright eyes showing full awareness of the danger his presence brought to the woman who had saved his life. "Don't let them take us alive," Standing Wolf said quietly to Black Eagle in English, clearly intending for Catherine to hear and understand the stakes involved. "Better to die fighting than be executed as prisoners." "There will be no dying in my cabin," Catherine said firmly, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "Not if I can prevent it." She opened the door to find Captain Sullivan dismounted and approaching, his hand resting on his sidearm. Behind him, a dozen cavalry troopers remained mounted, rifles at the ready. Sullivan was a man in his 40s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service and the hard expression of someone who had seen too much frontier violence to retain any romantic notions about the nobility of warfare. "Captain Sullivan," Catherine said with forced calm, "what brings the army to my remote homestead?" Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he studied her face and posture. "We've been tracking a party of hostiles through this valley, Miss Wells, 3 warriors who raided a supply train near Wounded Knee Creek 5 days ago. The tracks led directly to your property." Catherine felt her mouth go dry, but she maintained her composure. "I haven't seen any raiders, Captain. As you can observe, I've been snowed in for the past several days." "Then you won't mind if we search your cabin," Sullivan replied, stepping closer to the door. "Just to ensure your safety, of course." The request was clearly not optional, and Catherine knew that refusing would only confirm Sullivan's suspicions. But allowing him inside would expose her guests and likely lead to a bloodbath in her small home. She found herself caught between impossible choices, each leading to disaster. "Captain," she said, playing for time, "surely you can see that I'm hardly in a position to harbor fugitives. I'm a single woman living alone with limited supplies. How could I possibly?" Her words were cut off by a sound from inside the cabin. Joseph had attempted to rise from the table and knocked over a tin cup, the metallic clatter echoing clearly in the tense silence. Sullivan's hand immediately went to his weapon, his body tensing for action. "What was that?" he demanded, pushing past Catherine toward the cabin's interior. Catherine knew the moment of truth had arrived. There was no hiding the situation now, no possibility of deception that would survive even cursory investigation. Her only hope lay in appealing to whatever remained of Sullivan's humanity, and making him see the medical crisis rather than the political implications of what he was about to discover. "Captain, wait," she said, catching his arm. "Before you go in there, you need to understand something. I am a physician, as my father was before me. 3 days ago, these men came to me seeking medical help for a dying family member. I gave that help because it was the right thing to do, regardless of politics or race." Sullivan's expression hardened further. "You're harboring hostiles? Miss Wells, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've saved a young man's life," Catherine replied steadily. "Just as I would save yours if you came to me wounded and dying." Without another word, Sullivan pushed into the cabin, his hand on his pistol. Catherine followed, her heart pounding as she watched him take in the scene before him. Black Eagle standing protectively near his son. Standing Wolf and Gray Hawk positioned defensively, but not yet threatening, and Joseph himself, struggling to sit upright despite his obvious weakness. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tableau held frozen in potential violence, with Sullivan's surprise at finding not savage raiders, but a makeshift hospital ward clearly visible on his face. His eyes moved from the medical supplies scattered around the room to Joseph's bandaged shoulder to the careful way the other Lakota men positioned themselves between their wounded companion and potential threat. "Jesus Christ," Sullivan breathed, his hand tightening on his weapon. "You're treating the son of Black Eagle. Do you know who this man is, Miss Wells? Do you know how many soldiers have died trying to capture him?" "I know he's a father worried about his child," Catherine replied. "And I know his son was dying when they brought him here." Nothing else seemed relevant at the time. Sullivan's face flushed with anger. "Nothing else relevant? This man is one of the most wanted war leaders in the entire territory. There's a bounty on his head that would buy you a house in St. Louis. And you're treating him like some kind of honored guest." Black Eagle spoke for the first time since Sullivan's arrival, his English careful but clear. "Captain Sullivan, I know you by reputation, as you know me. I give you my word. We came here only for healing. No raid, no war. My son was dying. Your word?" Sullivan laughed harshly. "The word of a savage who's been killing white settlers for the past 10 years? Your word isn't worth the powder to blow it to hell." The insult hung in the air like a physical presence, and Catherine could see Standing Wolf's jaw clench with barely controlled rage. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, moving toward violence that would likely end with death for everyone in the cabin. She had to do something to break the cycle of escalation before it reached the point of no return. "Captain," she said firmly, stepping between Sullivan and the Lakota men, "these people came to me as patients, not as enemies. They have been respectful of my home and grateful for my care. Whatever crimes you believe Black Eagle has committed, his son has committed none except being born Lakota." "His son is a warrior too," Sullivan countered. "Probably killed his share of whites in the recent fighting." "They're all guilty, Miss Wells, every last one of them." Catherine felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of Joseph's humanity. "He's barely older than I am. And right now he's a patient who nearly died from infection because he couldn't get proper medical care. That's what I see when I look at him, not an enemy, but someone who needed help." Outside, she could hear the cavalry horses moving restlessly, and she realized that Sullivan's men were growing impatient. The longer this confrontation continued, the more likely it was that someone would make a fatal mistake. She needed to find a solution that would allow everyone to leave alive, but the political realities of the situation seemed to make that impossible. "Miss Wells," Sullivan said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a reasonable tone, "I understand you meant well, but you've been taken advantage of by these savages. They've used your natural compassion against you, put you in danger while serving their own purposes. The best thing now is for you to step aside and let us take them into custody." "Into custody?" Black Eagle spoke with bitter irony. "You mean to your fort, where we will be hanged or shot while trying to escape." Sullivan's lack of denial was answer enough. Catherine realized that custody was simply a euphemism for execution, and that Sullivan saw this as an opportunity to eliminate one of the most effective Lakota leaders without the inconvenience of a formal trial or the potential for prisoner exchange. "I won't allow it," Catherine said quietly. "These men are under my protection as patients. If you want to arrest them, you'll have to go through me first." The declaration surprised everyone in the room, including Catherine herself. She had not planned to make such a stand, but something about Sullivan's casual assumption that he could simply execute her patients in her own home triggered a fierce protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. "Miss Wells," Sullivan said, his voice hardening again, "you're interfering with military justice. I could arrest you as well for harboring fugitives." "Then arrest me," Catherine replied, crossing her arms. "But you'll have to explain to your superiors why you executed wounded men in a medical sanctuary and imprisoned the only trained healer within 50 miles of your fort." The practical implications of her argument seemed to give Sullivan pause. Catherine was indeed the closest thing to a doctor available to Fort Robinson, and her skills had been called upon more than once to treat injured soldiers. Arresting her would create significant problems for the garrison, especially with winter approaching and the likelihood of more medical emergencies increasing. Standing Wolf chose that moment to speak, his voice calm but carrying an underlying threat. "Captain Sullivan, you have a choice to make. Leave here with honor, let healing continue, or start a fight that ends with many dead, including soldiers outside." Sullivan's hand moved to his pistol, but Catherine could see him calculating odds and consequences. 3 experienced Lakota warriors in a confined space could kill several soldiers before being overwhelmed, and the political fallout from a massacre at a medical sanctuary would be severe. The Army was already facing criticism from Eastern newspapers and politicians for its handling of Indian affairs. "This isn't over," Sullivan finally said, but Catherine could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Miss Wells, you're making a serious mistake. These people are not your friends, regardless of how they're acting now. When they're strong enough, they'll turn on you." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," Catherine replied. "But right now, they're patients, and I have a duty to protect them." Sullivan holstered his weapon, but his expression remained hostile. "I'll be reporting this to my commanding officer. The Army won't forget that you chose to harbor enemies of the United States. And I won't forget that you threatened to execute wounded men in my hospital," Catherine countered. "I'm sure the territorial governor would be interested in that information as well." The standoff continued for several more tense minutes, with Sullivan clearly wanting to assert his authority, but recognizing the complexity of the situation he had stumbled into. Finally, he turned toward the door, but paused to deliver a parting threat. "Miss Wells, when these savages show their true nature, don't expect the Army to come running to your rescue. You've chosen your side, and you'll have to live with the consequences." After Sullivan and his men departed, the cabin fell into an uneasy silence. The confrontation had changed everything, stripping away the fragile isolation that had allowed Catherine's unusual patience to recover in peace. Now the outside world knew about her choice to help Black Eagle's son, and the consequences would be far-reaching and unpredictable. Black Eagle was the first to speak, his voice heavy with concern. "Medicine Woman, you have made a powerful enemy. Today, Captain Sullivan will not forget or forgive." Catherine nodded, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "I know, but I couldn't let him harm Joseph while he was helpless." "You risk much for people not your own," Standing Wolf observed. "Why?" Catherine looked at Joseph, who was watching her with new respect and understanding in his fever-bright eyes. "Because suffering is suffering, regardless of who experiences it. And because I believe there has to be a better way than the endless cycle of revenge that's destroying this territory." Gray Hawk spoke for the first time since the soldiers' arrival, his English heavily accented but clear. "You speak of a different path. But can a path of peace exist when men like Sullivan hold power?" It was a question that went to the heart of Catherine's growing dilemma. By choosing to help Black Eagle's son, she had not just saved a life. She had taken a stand that put her at odds with her own people's expectations, and potentially with the law itself. The comfortable neutrality she had maintained as an isolated frontier healer was no longer possible. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As evening approached, and Joseph's fever returned, Catherine found herself contemplating the true cost of her choice. She had gained the respect and gratitude of the Lakota men, but she had also made an enemy of the local military authorities. Word of her treason would spread throughout the settlements, and she would likely face ostracism from the white community that had previously accepted her as an essential service provider. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. But as she watched Black Eagle tenderly care for his recovering son, Catherine felt a conviction growing within her that some choices transcended personal safety. She had discovered something in the past few days that she had never expected to find, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple medical practice to encompass a larger vision of what healing could mean in a divided world. The resistance and doubt that had initially plagued her decision to help were giving way to a deeper understanding of the role she might play in bridging this seemingly impossible divide between two cultures at war. But with that understanding came the recognition that the real challenges were only beginning, and that the next phase of her journey would test not just her medical skills, but her fundamental beliefs about justice, mercy, and the possibility of peace in a land consumed by hatred. In the weeks that followed Captain Sullivan's threatening visit, Catherine's world transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. Joseph's recovery progressed steadily under her careful attention, but his improving health brought new complications rather than resolution. As word of her defiance of military authority spread throughout the territory, she found herself caught between two worlds that seemed increasingly incompatible. The first sign of her changing status came 3 days after the confrontation, when old Pete Morrison arrived at her cabin unannounced. The grizzled prospector had been her nearest white neighbor, and she had treated his arthritis with willow bark tea on several occasions. But the man who dismounted from his mule that morning bore little resemblance to the friendly hermit she had known. "Miss Catherine," Pete said, without his usual warmth, his weathered hands fidgeting with his hat brim. "I come to warn you. Word's getting around about what happened here. Folks in Deadwood are talking, and they ain't happy about you harboring them Sioux." Catherine invited him inside for coffee, but Pete declined, his eyes darting nervously toward the cabin where he clearly suspected her Lakota guests might still be present. In fact, Black Eagle and his companions had moved their camp to a hidden valley about 2 miles away, returning daily to check on Joseph's progress and assist with his continued treatment. "What exactly are people saying?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Pete shuffled his feet uncomfortably. "They're saying you've gone native, Miss Catherine. That you can't be trusted anymore. Some are even saying you might be passing information to the hostiles about troop movements and such." The accusation hit Catherine like a physical blow. The idea that anyone could believe she would betray military operations was absurd, but she realized that her defense of Black Eagle's family had crossed a line in the minds of many settlers. To them, any act of kindness toward Indians was tantamount to treason. "Pete, you know me," she said quietly. "You know I would never do anything to endanger innocent people." The old prospector's expression softened slightly, but his discomfort remained evident. "I know you got a good heart, Miss Catherine, but good hearts can lead folks astray when they don't understand what they're dealing with. These ain't people like us. They got different ways, different loyalties." After Pete left, Catherine found herself truly alone for the first time since the crisis began. Joseph had been moved to the hidden camp that morning, finally strong enough to travel short distances, though he still required daily medical attention. The cabin felt empty and strange without the presence of her unexpected patients, and she realized how much their company had meant to her during the long winter days. But the isolation also gave her time to think, to process the magnitude of the choice she had made and its implications for her future. She could no longer pretend that helping Black Eagle's son had been a simple medical decision. By standing up to Captain Sullivan, by publicly defending her Lakota patients, she had made a political statement that would follow her for the rest of her life. The next test came when Sarah Bennett, the wife of a local rancher, arrived seeking treatment for her youngest daughter's persistent cough. Sarah had been one of Catherine's regular patients, and the little girl's condition was serious enough to require immediate attention. But as Catherine prepared her medicines, she could sense a tension in Sarah's manner that had never been present before. "I heard about what happened with the soldiers," Sarah said finally, as Catherine mixed a syrup of honey and pine needle extract for the child. "Is it true you sheltered hostile Indians in your home?" Catherine chose her words carefully, aware that Sarah's opinion would likely be shared throughout the scattered ranching community. I treated a young man who was dying from an infected wound. His family brought him here seeking medical help. But they were Sioux, Sarah pressed. The same people who've been raiding homesteads and killing settlers. They were a father and his companions trying to save a son's life, Catherine replied. Just as you're trying to save your daughter's health by bringing her here. Sarah's face flushed with anger. That's not the same thing at all. My husband says we can't trust you anymore, that you might have told them about our ranch, about where we keep our livestock. The implications stung more than Catherine had expected. These people had been her community, her connection to the world beyond her isolated cabin. Now that connection was being severed by suspicion and fear, leaving her more alone than ever before. Sarah, Catherine said gently, handing her the medicine for her daughter, I've never betrayed a confidence in my life. Every family I've treated, every medical condition I've encountered, has remained private. That includes the Lakota family. And it includes yours. But even as Sarah accepted the medicine, Catherine could see the doubt in her eyes. The woman paid for the treatment and left quickly, and Catherine suspected it would be the last time she would see the Bennett family unless their need became truly desperate. Over the following days, Catherine established a new routine that reflected her changed circumstances. Each morning, she would ride to the hidden valley where Black Eagle's small band had made their temporary camp. The location was well chosen, sheltered from wind by high cliffs and accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended if necessary. The camp itself was a revelation to Catherine, demonstrating an efficiency and harmony with the natural environment that challenged many of her preconceptions about Indian life. The temporary shelters were ingeniously designed to provide maximum warmth and comfort while remaining easily transportable. The division of labor among the band members was clear and respectful, with everyone contributing according to their abilities and the group's needs. Joseph's recovery became the focal point of these daily visits, but Catherine found herself learning about much more than Lakota medical practices. Black Eagle proved to be a thoughtful teacher, explaining the reasoning behind various tribal customs and sharing stories that illuminated the complex history of his people's relationship with the expanding American frontier. My father's father signed the first treaty with the Great White Father, Black Eagle told her one morning as she changed Joseph's bandages. Was promised land would be ours forever, that white men would not come to sacred hills. But forever is short word for white government. Catherine had heard the government's version of these treaties, of course, but listening to Black Eagle's perspective gave her a deeper understanding of the grievances that had led to the current conflict. The Black Hills, sacred to the Lakota, had been promised to them in perpetuity, only to be seized when gold was discovered there. The pattern of broken promises and forced relocations had created a legacy of distrust that made peaceful coexistence seem nearly impossible. Why did you trust me? Catherine asked one day, as Joseph demonstrated his recovering strength by helping his father repair a piece of equipment. Given your experience with white people, why risk bringing your son to someone you didn't know? Black Eagle considered the question seriously before answering. Standing Wolf's cousin, he was hurt bad in a hunting accident 2 summers ago. White Trapper found him, brought him to Medicine Man at the trading post. Medicine Man, he help, ask no questions about who or why, save young warrior's life. The story surprised Catherine, representing a side of frontier relations that rarely made it into the newspapers or official reports. For every tale of violence and betrayal, there might be another story of quiet cooperation and mutual aid that went unrecorded because it didn't fit the prevailing narrative of inevitable conflict. That Medicine Man, Black Eagle continued, he teaches that healing spirit lives in some white people, just as warrior spirit lives in some Lakota. We learn to see person, not just skin color. As Joseph grew stronger, he began to participate. more actively in the conversations that filled Catherine's daily visits to the camp. His English was better than his father's, learned during a brief period when he had attended a mission school before the family had decided that white education was incompatible with Lakota values. "I remember you," Joseph said one afternoon, surprising Catherine as she checked his healing wound. "From before I was sick. You came to the trading post with supplies, spoke with my cousin about herbs for pain." Catherine searched her memory and recalled a brief encounter several months earlier with a young Indian man who had shown unusual knowledge about medicinal plants. She had assumed he was simply a knowledgeable guide, never imagining he might be the son of one of the most prominent war chiefs in the territory. "You didn't tell me you were watching the settlement," she said with mild reproach. Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "We watch everything. How else do we know which white people might help, which might hurt? We see you help anyone who comes. No ask for payment from poor people, no turn away dirty trappers or rough cowboys." The revelation that she had been under observation for months was unsettling, but Catherine found herself more curious than alarmed. The idea that the Lakota had been systematically studying the white settlement, evaluating the character and behavior of individual settlers, suggested a level of strategic thinking that contradicted the common portrayal of Indian actions as random and savage. Standing Wolf, who had remained largely silent during Catherine's previous visits, began to open up as Joseph recovered. He shared his own experiences with white civilization, including a traumatic encounter with soldiers that had left him deeply suspicious of American promises and motivations. "I was young," he said one evening as they sat around a small fire, "believed whites and Indians could live in peace. Went to the fort with a peace delegation, carrying white flag. Soldiers, they take us prisoner anyway, keep us locked up for moons, say we are spies, that peace talk is a trick." The story explained Standing Wolf's initial hostility during their first encounter, and Catherine began to understand the courage it had taken for these men to approach her cabin seeking help. They had risked not just military capture, but their own deeply held beliefs about the trustworthiness of white people. As winter deepened and Catherine's isolation from white society became more pronounced, she found herself spending longer periods at the Lakota camp. The intellectual stimulation of learning about a different culture, combined with the sense of purpose that came from Joseph's continued recovery, provided a stark contrast to the growing hostility she faced in her interactions with settlers. The medical aspects of Joseph's care evolved as well, moving beyond simple wound treatment to a more complex exchange of knowledge between different healing traditions. Greyhawk, she learned, was the band's medicine man, and he proved eager to share information about Lakota remedies and surgical techniques. "Your father, he teach you much," Greyhawk observed one day as Catherine demonstrated a technique for cleaning infected wounds. "But Lakota medicine knows things white medicine does not know. Maybe we can teach each other." The collaboration that developed between Catherine and Greyhawk became one of the most rewarding aspects of her daily visits to the camp. She learned about the use of plants she had never considered for medical purposes, while sharing knowledge of surgical procedures and anatomical understanding that impressed the Lakota healer. "In White World," Catherine explained as she showed Greyhawk her father's medical instruments, "we try to understand the body by cutting it open, studying each part. Your way seems to understand how all parts work together. Body is like a river." Greyhawk replied, "White medicine sees rocks, trees, animals by water. Lakota medicine sees flowing, sees how everything is connected." The philosophical differences in their approaches to healing led to long discussions that often extended well into the evening. Catherine found herself questioning assumptions she had never thought to examine, while gaining new perspectives on the nature of illness and recovery that would influence her practice for years to come. But even as she grew more comfortable in the Lakota camp, Catherine remained aware of the precarious nature of their situation. Joseph's recovery was progressing well, but the longer he remained in the area, the greater the risk became for everyone involved. Captain Sullivan had not returned, but military patrols had been spotted in the surrounding valleys, and there were reports of increased tensions throughout the territory. The question of what would happen when Joseph was fully recovered remained unspoken but present in everyone's thoughts. Black Eagle and his companions would eventually need to rejoin their main band, probably somewhere much farther west where the Army's presence was less concentrated. But their departure would leave Catherine alone again, more isolated than ever from both white and Indian society. "When we go," Black Eagle said one evening, as if reading her thoughts, "you will be in danger from both sides. My people, some will not understand why white women help us. Your people, they already show distrust." Catherine nodded, having given considerable thought to her uncertain future. "I knew there would be consequences when I made the choice to help Joseph. I'm prepared to face them. But are you prepared to live with them for the rest of your life?" Standing Wolf asked, "This choice, it changed everything. Cannot be undone." The question forced Catherine to confront the full magnitude of her situation. She had crossed a line that few white people ever crossed, creating relationships and gaining knowledge that set her apart from her own culture, while not fully accepting her into Lakota society. She was becoming something new, something without clear precedent in the territorial conflicts of her time. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the most important choices are the ones that change everything. Maybe that's what this territory needs. People willing to risk everything for the possibility of something better." As Joseph regained his strength and began participating in hunting and camp activities, Catherine realized that her role was evolving beyond that of a simple medical provider. She was becoming a bridge between worlds, a translator not just of language but of values and perspectives that had seemed irreconcilably different. The deepening of her commitment to this role would soon be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. As forces beyond the hidden valley were moving toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Black Eagle's family, but the future of relationships between white and Indian peoples throughout the Dakota Territory. The knowledge and friendship she had gained during these weeks of intensive cultural exchange were about to face their ultimate test, and Catherine would be forced to choose not just between competing loyalties, but between different visions of what America could become in the years ahead. The crisis that would test everything, Catherine had learned and believed, arrived on a wet, bitter February morning, 3 months after she had first pulled Joseph Crowfeather back from the edge of death. She was grinding willow bark in her cabin, preparing medicine for a bout of rheumatism that had been troubling Gray Hawk, when the sound of approaching horses shattered the winter silence. But this time, the riders were not coming from the direction of Fort Robinson or the scattered white settlements. They were approaching from the west, from the direction of the Lakota winter camps, and they were riding hard. Catherine recognized Red Cloud Woman immediately, even before the Lakota war leader dismounted from her lathered horse. She was Black Eagle's sister, a woman whose reputation for fierce intelligence and strategic thinking was known throughout the territory. Her presence at Catherine's cabin could only mean that something catastrophic had occurred in the main Lakota camp. "Medicine Woman," Red Cloud Woman said in English that was heavily accented but clear, "my brother sends word. Great danger comes. You must choose now. Stay with white world that rejects you, or come with us to a place of safety." The urgency in Red Cloud Woman's voice sent a chill through Catherine that had nothing to do with the February cold. "What's happened?" she asked, already moving to gather her medical supplies. "Army comes in great numbers," Red Cloud Woman replied, her dark eyes reflecting both anger and fear. "Not just soldiers from the fort, many regiments with big guns that shoot far. They say all Lakota must go to reservation immediately or be destroyed." Catherine's blood chilled as she understood the implications. This was not another skirmish or limited military action, but the massive campaign that military leaders had been threatening since the defeat at Little Bighorn. The army was moving to end Lakota resistance once and for all, regardless of the cost in lives on both sides. "How long do we have?" Catherine asked, her training as a healer immediately shifting her focus to the practical necessities of the situation. "Perhaps 2 days," Red Cloud Woman answered. "Maybe less. Scouts say soldiers move fast, use many horses. They will sweep through the valley like grass fire, burn everything." As Catherine began packing her most essential medical supplies, her mind raced through the implications of the choice being offered to her. To stay meant certain isolation and probable death if she was found aiding Lakota refugees. To go meant abandoning her cabin, her father's homestead, and any hope of ever returning to white society. It also meant committing herself fully to a people and a way of life that she had only begun to understand. "Where is Joseph?" she asked as she secured her surgical instruments in their leather case. "With the wounded," Red Cloud Woman replied. "Many hurt in last fight with soldiers. Joseph leads them to hiding place in sacred caves. He says Medicine Woman promised to help any who suffer, white or Indian." The reference to her own words, spoken months ago in very different circumstances, struck Catherine with their weight. She had indeed made that promise, not just to Joseph and his family, but to herself and to the principles her father had taught her. Now those principles were being tested under the most extreme conditions possible. "How many wounded?" Catherine asked, already knowing that the number would be beyond her ability to treat adequately. "Too many," Red Cloud Woman admitted. "Some will die without help. Others, maybe you can save. But we must go now, before soldiers find this place." Catherine looked around her cabin one final time, taking in the familiar surroundings that had been her refuge and her prison for so many months. Her father's medical books lined the shelves, his instruments hung in their appointed places, and the herbs he had taught her to cultivate filled jars and containers throughout the room. This had been her inheritance, her connection to a family legacy of healing that stretched back generations. But as she contemplated abandoning it all, Catherine realized that the true inheritance her father had left her was not the physical objects or even the knowledge contained in his books. It was the commitment to healing that transcended boundaries of race, politics, and personal safety. That inheritance could travel with her, could be shared with people who needed it regardless of where she found herself. "I'm ready," she said, shouldering her pack and picking up her medical bag. "But I need to leave a letter in case anyone comes looking." Red Cloud Woman nodded impatiently while Catherine quickly wrote a brief note explaining her departure. She dated it carefully and left it on her father's desk where it would be easily found. The letter simply stated that she had gone to provide medical assistance to wounded civilians and would return when the crisis had passed. She knew it was unlikely that anyone would believe such an explanation, but she wanted some record of her motivations for posterity. The ride to the hidden Lakota camp was brutal, covering rough terrain and bitter cold while maintaining a pace that left no time for rest or conversation. Red Cloud Woman led them through canyons and across frozen streams that Catherine had never known existed, following paths that seemed to have been carved by nature specifically to conceal the passage of people who needed to remain invisible. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Catherine began to encounter signs of the massive displacement that was occurring throughout Lakota territory. Small groups of refugees appeared briefly on distant ridges before disappearing again into the landscape, families fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry, warriors moving to join defensive positions that might slow the army's advance. Hidden Camp, when they finally reached it, was far larger than Catherine had expected. Hundreds of people had gathered in a series of connected caves and overhangs that had been used as sacred sites by the Lakota for generations. The natural formations provided excellent concealment from aerial observation while offering protection from the harsh mountain weather. But the sheer number of people crowded into the limited space had created conditions that were ripe for disease and injury. Joseph Crowfeather met them at the entrance to the main cave, and Catherine was struck by how much he had changed since their first meeting. The fever-weakened young man she had nursed back to health had been transformed into a confident leader, organizing the care of wounded warriors and the protection of non-combatants with an efficiency that spoke to both his natural abilities and the harsh education provided by months of warfare. "Medicine woman," he said, using the name by which she had become known throughout the Lakota camps. "I am grateful you came. We have many who need your skills." Catherine followed Joseph deeper into the cave system, and what she saw there challenged every assumption she had held about frontier warfare. The wounded were not just warriors, but women and children who had been caught up in the Army's sweeping advance. Some had been injured in attacks on their camps, others hurt during the desperate flight to find safety. All needed medical attention that was simply not available through traditional Lakota healing methods. "Gray Hawk does what he can," Joseph explained as they moved among the injured, "but his medicine works slowly, and some wounds need white doctor's tools." Catherine began her assessment methodically, drawing on everything her father had taught her about triage and emergency medicine. Some patients needed immediate surgery to survive. Others required careful monitoring but could wait, and a few were beyond help regardless of intervention. The decisions were heartbreaking but necessary, and she was grateful for the emotional discipline her medical training had instilled in her. The first surgery she performed was on a young woman who had been shot in the abdomen during an attack on her family's camp. The bullet had missed vital organs but had caused significant internal bleeding that needed to be controlled immediately. Working by lamplight in a makeshift operating area, Catherine found herself drawing on knowledge and skills she had never used under such primitive conditions. "Can you save her?" asked the woman's husband, a warrior whose own arm was bound with bloody cloth, but who had refused treatment until his wife's condition was addressed. "I think so," Catherine replied, focusing on the delicate work of repairing damaged tissue. "But she need careful monitoring for several days." As word of Catherine's presence spread through the camp, a steady stream of patients began arriving. At her improvised medical station, warriors with infected wounds, children with injuries from falls during the hasty evacuation, elderly people whose chronic conditions had been aggravated by the stress and physical demands of flight from the advancing army. Each case presented its own challenges, complicated by limited supplies and primitive conditions. Catherine found herself improvising constantly, using techniques she had read about, but never practiced, adapting her father's instruments for purposes they had never been intended to serve, and combining white medical knowledge with Lakota healing traditions in ways that neither culture had ever contemplated. Gray Hawk proved to be an invaluable assistant, his knowledge of traditional medicines complementing Catherine's surgical skills in ways that produced better outcomes than either approach could have achieved alone. Together, they developed new techniques for pain management, wound cleaning, and infection control that drew on the best elements of both medical traditions. "Your people and my people," Gray Hawk observed during a brief rest between patients. "They think their way is the only way. But sickness, injury, they do not care about skin color or language. Pain speaks the same words to all." The collaboration between Catherine and Gray Hawk became a symbol of hope within the refugee camp, demonstrating that cooperation between whites and Indians was not only possible but could produce results that benefited everyone involved. Their medical partnership became a topic of conversation around the evening fires, with people beginning to imagine possibilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. But even as Catherine threw herself into the medical challenges of the refugee camp, she remained acutely aware of the larger crisis developing around them. Scouts brought daily reports of the Army's advance, and the news was consistently grim. Multiple columns of soldiers were converging on the region, equipped with artillery and supported by supply trains, that would allow them to maintain pressure for weeks or months if necessary. "They mean to end this once and for all," Black Eagle told Catherine one evening as they discussed the tactical situation. "No more treaties, no more negotiations, only surrender or death." The stark choice facing the Lakota people was reflected in the debates that filled the camp each night. Some argued for immediate flight to Canada, where they might find sanctuary beyond the reach of American military power. Others advocated for a fighting retreat that would make the Army pay a heavy price for its victory while buying time for non-combatants to escape. A few still hoped for negotiation, believing that the presence of women and children might constrain the Army's actions. Catherine found herself uniquely positioned in these discussions, as someone who understood both cultures and could provide insights into American military thinking and political motivations. Her observations were sought by the Lakota leadership, and she found herself playing a role in strategic planning that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "Army will not stop until all Lakota are on reservations," she told the council of war leaders who had gathered to plan their response to the approaching crisis. "Officers like Captain Sullivan see any free Indian as a threat to be eliminated. They will not be satisfied with partial victory." "Then we fight," declared Red Cloud Woman, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had seen too much betrayal. "To believe in peaceful solutions. Better to die free than live as prisoners." But Standing Wolf offered a different perspective, one that reflected the complex realities of their situation. "If we fight, many die who need not die. Women, children, old ones. May be better to find a way that saves most lives, even if it means giving up freedom." The debate continued through the night, with Catherine listening to arguments that touched on fundamental questions of human dignity, cultural survival, and the price of resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. She was struck by the sophistication of the discussion, the careful consideration of consequences that contradicted every stereotype about impulsive savage behavior. As dawn approached, a new development added urgency to their deliberations. A scout arrived with word that a smaller column of soldiers, separate from the main army, was approaching the valley where Catherine's cabin stood. The force was led by Captain Sullivan himself, apparently conducting a targeted search for the woman who had defied his authority months earlier. "He seeks to make an example," Black Eagle observed grimly. "Show what happens to whites who help Indians." Catherine felt a chill of recognition as she understood Sullivan's strategy. By capturing or killing her, he would send a message to any other whites who might be tempted to show sympathy for Lakota resistance. Her fate had become a symbol in the larger conflict, representing the possibility or impossibility of cooperation between the races. "I have to go back," Catherine said, the words emerging before she had fully thought through their implications. "If I surrender to Sullivan, it might buy time for the camp to escape." The suggestion was met with immediate and vehement opposition from everyone present. Joseph spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had become a respected leader among his people. "Medicine Woman saved my life when no hope remained," he said. "Now we save hers. We do not give our friends to enemies, no matter what advantages it might bring." Red Cloud Woman nodded agreement. "You are under our protection now. To surrender would be betrayal of everything we claim to believe about loyalty and honor." But even as Catherine felt moved by their determination to protect her, she also understood the tactical realities of their situation. Sullivan's search for her was drawing military attention toward the hidden camp, and her presence among the refugees increased the danger for everyone involved. "There might be another way," she said, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "What if I go back, but not to surrender? What if I try to mislead Sullivan, send him in the wrong direction while you move the camp?" The suggestion sparked intense discussion among the Lakota leaders, with some seeing merit in the plan while others worried about the risks involved. Catherine would be placing herself in extreme danger, and if Sullivan detected her deception, The consequences would be severe for everyone involved. As the debate continued, Catherine found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been an isolated frontier healer, concerned primarily with her own survival and the continuation of her father's medical practice. Now she was an integral part of a refugee community, her skills and knowledge essential to the survival of people who had been complete strangers when she first chose to help them. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable, but it had given her a sense of purpose that transcended personal safety or social acceptance. She had discovered that healing could be more than treating individual patients. It could be about building bridges between hostile communities, about demonstrating that cooperation was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. The choice she faced now would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the relationships she had helped to create between white and Lakota communities. Whatever decision she made would send a message about the possibility of mutual understanding and respect in a land that seemed determined to resolve its conflicts through violence. As the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks surrounding their hidden sanctuary, Catherine realized that the crucible moment had arrived. Everything she had learned, everything she believed, everything she hoped for the future would be tested in the hours and days ahead. The outcome would determine whether the bridge she had tried to build between two worlds would survive, or whether it would be swept away by the larger forces of war and hatred that seemed to dominate the Dakota territory. The wounded around her continued to require care. The refugees needed medical attention, and somewhere below in the valley, Captain Sullivan was conducting a search that could lead to disaster for everyone she had come to care about. The time for preparation and learning had passed. Now Catherine would discover whether the commitment she had made to healing and understanding was strong enough to survive the ultimate test of fire and blood that awaited them all. Catherine's decision to return to the valley as a decoy set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire conflict in ways no one could have anticipated. As she rode down from the mountain sanctuary in the pre-dawn darkness, accompanied only by Joseph Crowfeather and two experienced scouts, she carried with her more than just a desperate plan to mislead Captain Sullivan. She carried the hopes of hundreds of refugees and the possibility of demonstrating that another path existed beyond the cycle of violence that had consumed the Dakota territory. The ride through the frozen landscape was treacherous, made more dangerous by the need to avoid the army patrols that were systematically sweeping through the valley. Joseph had insisted on accompanying her despite Catherine's protests, arguing that her plan would be more credible if she appeared to have been captured by Lakota scouts rather than returning voluntarily. The distinction was crucial. A white woman fleeing Indian captors would be believed, while one cooperating with them would immediately be seen as a traitor. "Remember," Joseph said as they approached the area where Sullivan's patrol was likely to be searching, "you must seem frightened, desperate to escape. If the captain believes you are a willing ally, plan fails before it begins." Catherine nodded, though the deception sat uneasily with her. After months of genuine cooperation and growing friendship with the Lakota people, the idea of portraying them as captors felt like a betrayal of everything they had shared. But she understood the necessity. This charade might be the only thing standing between the refugee camp and complete destruction. As planned, Joseph and the scouts created a visible disturbance near the site of Catherine's abandoned cabin, setting small fires and making enough noise to attract the attention of any soldiers in the area. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving Catherine to approach the cabin alone, her clothing deliberately torn and her appearance carefully disheveled to support the story she would tell. The trap worked better than they had dared hope. Within minutes of Catherine's arrival at her cabin, a squad of cavalry came thundering up from the south, Captain Sullivan himself in the lead. His face showed a mixture of triumph and surprise as he saw Catherine standing beside her damaged home, apparently just arrived and clearly distressed. "Miss Wells," Sullivan called out as he dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Thank God you're alive. We've been searching for weeks, following reports that you'd been taken by hostiles." Catherine forced herself to appear, shaken and grateful, though every instinct rebelled against the performance she was giving. "Captain Sullivan, I thought I would never see civilized people again. They took me from here months ago, held me in their camp." Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he studied her appearance, looking for signs of abuse or mistreatment that would confirm his assumptions about Indian savagery. What he saw instead was a woman who appeared healthy and well cared for, which clearly puzzled him. "How did you escape?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely convinced by her story. Catherine had prepared for this question, drawing on her knowledge of the terrain to craft a plausible tale. They were moving camp, heading north toward the Canadian border. "There was confusion during a river crossing, and I managed to slip away in the darkness. I've been walking for 3 days, trying to find my way back." The mention of a northern movement immediately captured Sullivan's attention, as Catherine had known it would. Military intelligence had been trying to track the movements of the main Lakota bands for weeks, and any information about their direction would be considered valuable. "North, you say?" Sullivan pressed. "How many of them? What kind of weapons did they have?" Catherine provided carefully crafted details that would send Sullivan's forces in exactly the wrong direction, away from the mountain sanctuary where the refugees were hiding. She described a large war party moving toward the Yellowstone River, armed with repeating rifles and planning to join with other bands for a final push into Canada. Sullivan questioned her for over an hour, his interrogation growing more intense, as he tried to extract every detail that might be useful for military planning. Catherine answered carefully, maintaining her pose as a traumatized victim while providing information that would misdirect the Army's pursuit. The performance was exhausting, requiring her to suppress every instinct to defend the people who had become her friends and protectors. But even as she played her role, Catherine began to notice something unexpected happening among Sullivan's men. Several of the younger soldiers were listening to her account with expressions of discomfort, clearly troubled by the implications of what they were hearing. When she described the conditions in the Lakota camp, the presence of women and children, the desperate search for safety, the growing desperation as winter supplies ran low, some of the troopers exchanged glances that suggested her words were having an impact. One soldier in particular, a sergeant named Michael O'Brien, who appeared to be in his 30s, seemed especially affected by Catherine's carefully crafted narrative. When Sullivan stepped away to confer with his lieutenant about their next move, O'Brien approached Catherine with a canteen of water and a concerned expression. "Miss, I'm sorry for what you've been through," he said quietly. "Must have been terrible, being held by those savages for so long." Catherine accepted the water gratefully, using the moment to study O'Brien's face. What she saw there was not the hardened hatred she had expected, but something more complex, a man who was beginning to question the simple narrative of civilization versus savagery that had justified the Army's increasingly brutal tactics. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "they weren't all savages, some of them. Some of them were just families trying to survive. There were children, babies who were sick and hungry." O'Brien's expression darkened, but not with anger at the Indians. Instead, he seemed troubled by the implications of Catherine's words. "The captain says they're all hostiles, ma'am. Says there's no such thing as peaceful Indians anymore." "I know what the captain says," Catherine replied, lowering her voice so their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "But I saw what I saw. There were people in that camp who just wanted to live in peace, who were terrified of what was happening to their world." The seed of doubt that Catherine had planted in O'Brien's mind would prove to be more significant than she could have imagined at the time. As word of her escape and her accounts of the Lakota camp spread through the military ranks, other soldiers began to question the black and white portrayal of the conflict they had been given. Sullivan's decision to pursue the fictional war party toward the north brought the mountain refugees several days of safety, but it also created an unexpected opportunity for Catherine to influence the broader course of the conflict. As news of her rescue spread through the scattered settlements and military posts, her story began to take on a life of its own. The tale of a white woman surviving months of captivity and eventually escaping spread rapidly through the frontier communication network of traders, trappers, and travelers. But Catherine's carefully crafted narrative included details that complicated the standard captivity story, descriptions of Indian families struggling to survive, of attempts at peaceful coexistence, of the complex human realities that existed beyond the simple categories of friend and enemy. At Fort Robinson, Colonel James Mitchell, Sullivan's commanding officer, found himself dealing with questions he had not expected when Catherine was brought in for formal debriefing. She maintained her deception carefully, but she also used the opportunity to plant seeds of doubt about the wisdom of the current military strategy. "Colonel," she said during one of their interviews, "I understand the need to protect settlers, but what I saw in their camp, there were so many women and children, old, people who could barely walk. They're not warriors, they're refugees." Mitchell was a career soldier, but he was also a man who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the Indian Wars had taken. The massacre at Sand Creek years earlier had troubled him deeply, and he had been looking for ways to bring the current conflict to an end without repeating such atrocities. "Miss Wells," he said carefully, "your experience has obviously been traumatic, but you must understand that these people have been at war with the United States. They've killed soldiers and civilians alike." "Some have," Catherine agreed, "but not all. There are people in those camps who never wanted war, who would make peace if they believed it was possible. The question is whether we're willing to give them that chance." Catherine's influence on the military leadership was gradual but significant. Her status as a victim gave her words a credibility that no Indian advocate could have achieved, while her detailed knowledge of Lakota culture and conditions allowed her to speak with authority about the realities of the conflict. Meanwhile, back in the mountain sanctuary, the ripple effects of Catherine's mission were being felt in different ways. Joseph Crow Feather had returned with reports of successful misdirection, but also with news that Catherine's performance had been so convincing that some in the white community were beginning to see her as a hero rather than a traitor. "Strange," Greyhawk observed as they discussed the development around the evening fire. "White woman saves herself by telling lies about us and becomes more powerful to help us than when she told the truth." Black Eagle nodded thoughtfully. "Medicine woman understands that sometimes healing requires bitter medicine. She takes poison into herself to cure greater sickness." The philosophical implications of Catherine's deception sparked intense discussions. Throughout the refugee camp, some argued that any compromise with white authority was a betrayal of Lakota values, while others saw her strategy as a brilliant adaptation to the realities of their situation. Red Cloud woman offered perhaps the most pragmatic perspective. "Does not matter whether we approve of her methods," she said bluntly. "Question is whether they work to save our people." As days passed, it became clear that Catherine's intervention was indeed having effects far beyond the immediate tactical advantage of misdirecting Sullivan's patrol. Reports reached the mountain camp through the extensive Lakota intelligence network that conversations were happening in Fort Robinson and other military installations, conversations about the possibility of negotiated settlements rather than total military victory. The change was most evident in the behavior of Army patrols that were still operating in the region. Where once they had shot on sight at any Indian they encountered, some units were now showing restraint, apparently under orders to attempt capture rather than immediate elimination. The shift was subtle but significant, representing a crack in the military's unified commitment to total warfare. Sergeant O'Brien proved to be a particularly important convert to Catherine's cause. His growing doubts about the justice of the campaign led him to begin informal conversations with other soldiers, sharing Catherine's accounts of families struggling to survive, and questioning whether the Army's tactics were truly serving American interests. She said they had babies dying of hunger, O'Brien told his fellow soldiers around their evening campfire. Women weeping over children they couldn't feed. That's not the savage raiders we've been told we're fighting. These conversations spread through the ranks with surprising speed, creating a morale problem that military leaders could not ignore. Soldiers who had enlisted to protect American settlements found themselves questioning whether they were actually serving as instruments of genocide against desperate families. The crisis came to a head when a patrol led by O'Brien encountered a small group of Lakota refugees who had become separated from the main camp. Following previous orders, they should have attacked immediately, or at least attempted to capture the Indians as prisoners. Instead, O'Brien ordered his men to hold their fire while he attempted to communicate with the group. What followed was an unprecedented exchange between American soldiers and Lakota refugees, not a battle, but a conversation. Through a combination of sign language, broken English, and the translation provided by a young Lakota woman who had attended a mission school, the two groups actually talked to each other as human beings rather than enemies. The refugees were indeed desperate, an elderly couple and their daughter with her infant child, all weakened by hunger and exposure after becoming lost during the chaotic evacuation from their winter camp. They had been traveling for days without adequate food or shelter, and the baby was clearly ill. O'Brien faced a choice that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He could follow his orders and take the refugees prisoner, condemning them to almost certain death in military custody. Or he could act on the doubts that Catherine's story had planted in his mind, and try to help them reach safety. His decision to provide the refugees with food and directions to a safe route north represented a complete transformation of the dynamic between American forces and Lakota civilians. Word of the encounters spread rapidly through both military and Indian networks, creating a precedent that other soldiers and officers would have to confront. Captain Sullivan's reaction to news of O'Brien's unauthorized mercy was predictably violent. He immediately ordered the sergeant's arrest and court-martial for treason, declaring that any soldier who showed sympathy for Indians was a traitor to his uniform and his country. But Sullivan's harsh response only served to highlight the growing division within military ranks between those who supported total warfare and those who were beginning to question whether such tactics were either effective or moral. Colonel Mitchell found himself dealing with near mutinous conditions, as soldiers increasingly refused to carry out orders that conflicted with their evolving understanding of the conflict. The situation reached a breaking point when Catherine requested a meeting with Colonel Mitchell to discuss the possibility of arranging a peaceful surrender for the refugees hiding in the mountains. She argued that her experience as a captive had given her unique insights into Lakota thinking and that she might be able to serve as an intermediary to prevent further bloodshed. Mitchell was intrigued by the possibility, particularly given the morale problems he was facing within his own command. A negotiated settlement that avoided a costly mountain campaign while still achieving the Army's basic objective of moving the Lakota to reservations would solve multiple problems simultaneously, but Catherine's proposal also carried enormous risks. If she was discovered to have been cooperating with the Lakota rather than genuinely escaping from them, the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. And there was no guarantee that the Lakota leadership would be willing to trust negotiations conducted through military channels, given their long experience with broken promises and betrayed treaties. As Catherine prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her life, she carried with her the hopes and fears of hundreds of people whose lives hung in the balance. The ripple effect of her initial choice to save Joseph Crow Feather's life had spread far beyond anything she could have imagined, creating possibilities for peace that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The success or failure of her mission would determine whether the bridge she had tried to build between two cultures could survive the ultimate test of formal diplomacy, or whether the forces of hatred and mistrust would prove too strong to overcome. Everything she had learned about healing, about human nature, about the possibility of understanding across seemingly impossible divides, would be put to the test in the negotiations that lay ahead. The young woman who had once lived in isolation, treating the occasional injured trapper or settler, had become a figure whose actions might determine the fate of two peoples locked in what had seemed like an inevitable march toward mutual destruction. The ripple effect of compassion and courage had created waves that were now powerful enough to change the course of history itself. The peace negotiations that began in the spring of 1877 were unlike anything the Dakota Territory had ever witnessed. Rather than the formal military surrenders that had characterized previous endings to Indian conflicts, these talks represented something entirely new, a genuine attempt to find common ground between two peoples who had learned to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. Catherine Wells stood at the center of these unprecedented discussions, serving as both translator and mediator in conversations that would have been impossible without the trust she had built on both sides. The meeting place was carefully chosen, a neutral valley halfway between Fort Robinson and the mountain sanctuary where the Lakota refugees had spent the winter, far enough from military installations to allow the Indians to feel secure, but close enough to civilization to reassure the white negotiators. The delegation that emerged from the mountain camps on that first morning of formal talks reflected the complex leadership structure that had evolved during the months of crisis. Black Eagle led the group as the senior war chief, but he was accompanied by Red Cloud Woman, whose strategic insights had proven crucial during the winter siege, and by Gray Hawk, whose role as medicine man gave him spiritual authority that complemented the military leadership of the others. Joseph Crow Feather rode beside Catherine, his presence serving as a living reminder of where these negotiations had begun. The young warrior had become something more than just a patient or a friend. He had become a symbol of the possibility that understanding could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. His complete recovery and his obvious respect for the white woman who had saved his life spoke more powerfully than any words about the potential for cooperation between the two cultures. Colonel Mitchell had assembled his own diverse team for the negotiations. Alongside the expected military officials, he had included representatives from the territorial government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and even a Methodist minister who had expressed interest in establishing peaceful missions among the Lakota. Most significantly, he had also brought Sergeant O'Brien, whose transformation from a conventional soldier to an advocate for restraint had made him valuable as someone who could speak to the concerns of the enlisted men who would have to implement any agreement. The first days of talks were tentative and formal, with both sides testing the boundaries of what might be possible while protecting themselves against the possibility of betrayal. Catherine found herself serving not just as a translator of language, but as an interpreter of cultural nuances that could easily derail the delicate process if misunderstood. When Black Eagle speaks of the sacred hills, she explained to the white delegation during one crucial session, he's not just talking about geography. He's talking about the spiritual foundation of his people's identity. To ask them to abandon, that would be like asking Americans to abandon the Constitution. Similarly, she helped the Lakota understand the political pressures facing the American negotiators. Colonel Mitchell wants peace, she told the Indian leaders, but he has to answer to men in Washington who judge success only by whether the territory becomes safe for white settlement. We need to find terms that give him something he can defend. To his superiors, the breakthrough came during the second week of negotiations, when Joseph Crow Feather made an unexpected proposal that demonstrated how much his thinking had evolved during his recovery and the subsequent months of conflict. We have learned much about white medicine during this time, he said, Speaking directly to Colonel Mitchell through Catherine's translation, "Medicine woman taught us techniques that save lives our traditional healing could not save. Perhaps there are other things we can learn from each other." The idea of mutual learning rather than simple conquest or submission opened up possibilities that neither side had previously considered. What if the resolution of the conflict could involve more than just moving the Lakota to reservations? What if it could create a framework for ongoing cooperation that benefited both communities? Greyhawk expanded on Joseph's suggestion with a proposal that stunned the white negotiators. "We offer to share knowledge of plants and healing that your people do not know in exchange for training in your medical techniques. Some of our young people could learn white medicine. Some of your young people could learn Lakota ways." The medical exchange program that emerged from this suggestion became the cornerstone of the final agreement. Rather than the typical treaty that focused solely on land transfers and military arrangements, this accord established a framework for ongoing cultural and educational cooperation that would continue long after the immediate crisis had passed. Catherine would serve as the director of this exchange program, overseeing the training of Lakota students in white medical techniques while facilitating the education of white doctors and nurses in traditional Indian healing methods. The position gave her a formal role that legitimized her unique position between the two communities, while providing a sustainable foundation for the continued cooperation she had helped to create. The reservation established for Black Eagles Band was larger and more autonomous than typical government allocations, reflecting both the military respect the Lakota had earned through their effective resistance and the recognition that cooperation required genuine incentives rather than just the cessation of hostilities. Most importantly, the agreement included provisions for periodic leave that would allow tribal members to visit sacred sites in the Black Hills and maintain connections to their spiritual traditions. Sergeant O'Brien accepted a transfer to the new reservation as head of the small military contingent that would oversee the transition. His role was explicitly defined as protective rather than punitive. His job was to ensure that the terms of the agreement were honored by both sides and to serve as a liaison between the reservation and the territorial government. "Never thought I'd be working to protect Indians instead of fighting them," O'Brien confided to Catherine as they watched the first groups of Lakota families begin the journey to their new home. "But I've seen what cooperation can accomplish. Maybe it's time we tried something different." The success of the Dakota negotiations began to influence military policy throughout the Western Territories. Other commanders, facing their own costly and seemingly endless conflicts with various tribes, began to explore whether similar approaches might work in their regions. Catherine found herself consulted by officials from as far away as Arizona and Montana, all seeking to understand how she had managed to bridge such a seemingly impossible divide. But perhaps the most significant, long-term impact of the agreement was the personal transformation it had wrought in the individuals involved. Catherine had evolved from an isolated frontier healer to a recognized expert in cross-cultural communication and cooperation. Her medical practice expanded to serve both white and Indian communities, and her unique position allowed her to continue building understanding between peoples who had seemed destined for perpetual conflict. Joseph Crow Feather used his recovery and the respect he had gained during the negotiations to become a leader in the new cooperative framework. He established himself as an advocate for peaceful coexistence while maintaining his credibility within Lakota culture, demonstrating that it was possible to work with whites without abandoning Indian identity and values. The medical exchange program proved to be more successful than anyone had dared hope. Young Lakota men and women, surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge that dramatically improved health outcomes on the reservation, while white medical students gained insights into holistic healing approaches that enhanced their own practice. The program became a model that was eventually adopted throughout the Western Territories. Greyhawk became one of the most effective teachers in the exchange program. His deep knowledge of traditional healing methods combined with his willingness to learn from white medicine, creating a synthesis that benefited practitioners from both cultures. His collaborative work with Catherine resulted in medical innovations that neither tradition could have achieved alone. Red Cloud Woman used her strategic abilities to become an advocate for Indian rights within the territorial government, serving as an advisor on policies that affected not just her own people, but all the tribes within the region. Her presence in government councils ensured that Indian perspectives were heard in discussions that had previously excluded Native voices entirely. The personal relationship between Catherine and Joseph Crowfeather also evolved in directions that would have been unimaginable when she first pulled him back from the edge of death. Their shared experiences during the crisis had created a bond that transcended the cultural differences that might have made such a connection impossible under normal circumstances. When they married in the summer of 1878, the ceremony incorporated elements from both traditions, symbolizing the synthesis of cultures that had become possible through their mutual journey of discovery and growth. The wedding was attended by both Lakota families and white settlers, military officers and tribal leaders, creating a celebration that demonstrated the new possibilities that had emerged from the ashes of conflict. Their children would grow up truly bicultural, equally comfortable in both worlds and serving as living bridges between communities that had once been bitter enemies. The family they created became a symbol of hope for others who dared to imagine that the divisions that seemed so permanent and irreconcilable might actually be overcome through patience, understanding, and mutual respect. But the success of their personal story and the larger peace they had helped to create did not mean that all challenges had been resolved. There remained plenty of people on both sides who viewed the cooperation with suspicion and who worked to undermine the agreements whenever possible. Captain Sullivan, for instance, never accepted the legitimacy of the negotiations and spent his remaining career advocating for a return to military solutions to Indian problems. Some traditional Lakota leaders also remained skeptical of any arrangement with the American government, their distrust based on generations of broken promises and betrayed treaties. They watched the cooperation carefully, ready to withdraw their support if they detected any signs that the whites were reverting to their historical pattern of exploitation and betrayal. Catherine understood that the peace she had helped to create was fragile and required constant nurturing to survive. Her work in the medical exchange program was as much about maintaining relationships and building trust as it was about sharing knowledge and techniques. Every successful treatment, every collaboration between white and Indian healers, every student who learned to see beyond cultural stereotypes, represented a small victory in the larger struggle to sustain cooperation. The challenges were real and ongoing, but so were the rewards. As Catherine watched young Lakota healers successfully performing surgical procedures that would have been impossible without cross-cultural cooperation, as she saw white doctors incorporating traditional remedies into their practice with remarkable results, as she observed families from both communities working together on projects that benefited everyone, she felt a profound satisfaction that went far beyond personal happiness. She had discovered that healing could extend far beyond the treatment of individual ailments to encompass the repair of relationships between entire communities. The skills her father had taught her about medicine had provided the foundation, but the true achievement had been learning to see past the barriers of fear and prejudice to the common humanity that connected all people. The woman who had once lived in isolation, treating the occasional patient while struggling with loneliness and uncertainty, had become the center of a network of relationships that spanned cultures and transformed lives. Her choice to help a dying warrior had set in motion changes that rippled outward through both communities, creating new possibilities for understanding and cooperation. As she looked toward the future from her position at the medical school she had established on the reservation, Catherine could see new horizons opening up for both her own children and for the next generation of leaders from both cultures. The problems were far from solved, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and challenges ahead. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of relationship between peoples who had once seen each other only as enemies. The young woman who had pulled Joseph Crowfeather from the edge of death had not just saved a single life. She had helped to create a new model for how different cultures could coexist and learn from each other. Her legacy would live on in the institutions she had helped to create, the relationships she had nurtured, and the example she had set for others who dared to believe that understanding was possible even across the deepest divides. The new horizon she had helped to create stretched out before them all, offering hope for a future where healing and cooperation could triumph over fear and hatred, where the courage to reach across cultural boundaries could create possibilities that neither community could have achieved alone. The journey that had begun with a simple act of medical mercy had become a transformation that would influence the course of history for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.